She whispered, "It's cold tonight." I didn't hesitate. "Then share your blanket." And just like that, everything changed. The rain was coming down in quiet, steady sheets the evening I arrived at the apartment building. The city lights reflected off wet asphalt, painting streaks of gold and red across the sidewalk. I was lugging a single suitcase up the narrow, creaking staircase, feeling the chill of early winter biting at my fingers. The building had that old-world charm, worn wooden doors, the faint scent of polish and age, and an almost imperceptible hum of life behind each window. When I finally reached the door of my new apartment, I was greeted by her. My landlady, tall, graceful, and quietly confident, stood in the hallway with a scarf loosely draped around her shoulders. There was something about her presence, warm but understated, like sunlight filtering through fog. She smiled as she handed me the keys, her fingers brushing mine just slightly, enough to make my heart skip a beat. It was a small contact, almost accidental, but charged with something I couldn't name. "Welcome," she said, her voice low and even, carrying the faintest edge of amusement, as if she already knew I was nervous. She had this way of observing without seeming intrusive, her gaze lingering on me, softening in a way that suggested she was quietly curious. I noticed the subtle perfume she wore, a blend of vanilla and something woodsy, grounding me in the moment even as my mind raced. As I stepped inside the apartment, she lingered by the door, glancing around, ensuring everything was in order. The space was modest, but cozy, wooden floors, mismatched furniture that somehow felt intentionally arranged, and a window that opened onto the rain-slick street below. The radiator hummed faintly, struggling to keep the cold at bay. I unpacked slowly, aware of her presence even when she wasn't speaking. She moved with an unhurried grace, adjusting a picture frame here, straightening a rug there, and I realized I was watching her more than the apartment. There was a quiet steadiness to her movements, an ease I didn't have, and yet an unspoken tension lingered, like we were both holding our breath, waiting for something unnamed. Our first real interaction was fleeting, a handshake that lingered a fraction too long, a shared glance that held a question neither of us voiced. I could feel it, like static in the air, an awareness of proximity, a hint of curiosity, and maybe the tiniest flicker of attraction. Nothing overt, nothing bold, but enough to make the ordinary act of moving in feel charged with possibility. By the time she left, promising to check in tomorrow, I was left with the warmth of her presence lingering in the room, contrasting sharply with the cold draft sneaking through the window. That first spark, subtle, quiet, and entirely unexpected, was enough to make me wonder how someone could affect a person so profoundly without even trying. The next few days settled into a rhythm that felt both ordinary and charged with something unsaid. I spent my mornings unpacking boxes, arranging my small apartment, and occasionally glancing at the window, wondering what she might be doing. She would pop by unexpectedly, never intrusively, but with a soft knock and a faint smile that seemed to linger just a moment too long. One evening, she came to check the radiator, and I realized how much I had noticed her presence already. She moved with quiet precision, her hands adjusting the little dial while the heat hummed to life. I watched her from the doorway, noting the way her cardigan clung to her shoulders, the subtle curve of her profile in the dim light. When her hand brushed mine as she reached past to check the heater, a shiver ran up my arm, not from the cold, but from the brief contact. We shared tea one afternoon, sitting near the window where the rain fell steadily against the glass. Steam curled from our mugs, rising in thin, ephemeral trails. The warmth of the tea seemed to carry more than heat, it was intimate in a way words couldn't capture. Our conversation was light at first, apartment logistics, the weather, but there were pauses where neither of us spoke, and in those pauses, I felt the quiet gravity of her attention. She laughed at something small I said, a soft, melodic sound that lingered longer than it needed to, and I felt my chest tighten. Our eyes met more than once, each glance holding a question neither of us had the courage to voice. Her fingers brushed against mine as she handed me a spoon, and I caught myself holding the contact for just a heartbeat longer than necessary. Every visit carried subtle tension, a sense of proximity growing natural yet deliberate. We moved around the apartment, sometimes too close for coincidence, her shoulder grazing mine as she reached for a book, the warmth of her body brushing against mine as she leaned to check a shelf. It was unspoken, but each shared laugh, each lingering look, built a language of closeness between us. By the end of the week, I realized that I was no longer just observing her movements, I was memorizing them. The soft tilt of her head, the way her eyes softened when she smiled, the faint scent she left behind that seemed to linger long after she was gone. There was an unacknowledged tension, a slow pull between us that made ordinary moments feel electric. I knew then that this wasn't just about a new apartment or a friendly landlady. Something deeper was stirring, something quiet, deliberate, and entirely magnetic. And while neither of us said it, the electricity in the air promised that the first spark was only the beginning. A particularly cold night settled over the city, and the apartment felt sharper than usual, the radiator doing its best but barely keeping the chill at bay. She had come by, ostensibly to check on the heating, but I noticed immediately that she seemed smaller somehow, her slender frame wrapped in a thin cardigan that did little against the cold. Her hands trembled slightly as she fiddled with the dial, and I felt an unexpected tug of concern. "I think it's still a little drafty," she murmured, more to herself than to me. The softness in her voice, almost hesitant, made my chest tighten. I realized that beneath her poised exterior, there was a quiet vulnerability, a side of her she didn't usually show to the world. My instinct was to reach out, to offer comfort, but I hesitated, unsure if it would be welcome. As she turned to leave the radiator, her fingers brushed mine again, this time longer, almost deliberate, yet tentative. The warmth of her skin against mine lingered, leaving a subtle thrill that pulsed in my veins. She caught my gaze, and for a moment, her eyes softened, almost apologetic, and I felt the gravity of unspoken words between us. A silent acknowledgement of something growing, something delicate and urgent. I offered to help adjust the settings, moving close enough that our shoulders brushed. The warmth of her body seeped into mine, and I was struck by the contrast, her composed demeanor masking the vulnerability she couldn't, or wouldn't, voice. I could feel her hesitation, the subtle tension in her posture, and yet there was a trust there, fragile but present. We stood in the small, dimly lit room, the hum of the radiator filling the quiet space. I realized how acutely I was aware of her, every movement, every glance, every soft intake of breath. She shifted slightly closer as if seeking warmth without saying it outright. The simple act of proximity felt heavy with meaning, the ordinary brush of skin carried an unspoken promise. Finally, she murmured again, almost a whisper, "It's cold tonight." Her voice was low, intimate, and I felt a sudden, compelling urge to bridge the distance. My heart thumped at the quiet invitation hidden within her words. It wasn't bold, it wasn't overt, but it was enough. Enough to make me aware of the magnetic pull between us, the unacknowledged desire simmering beneath layers of politeness and restraint. That night, for the first time, I understood that our connection was evolving, shifting from casual acquaintance to something profoundly personal. Her vulnerability wasn't a weakness, it was an invitation. And in that moment, standing close with her, feeling the subtle warmth radiating from her, I knew that the slow, inevitable pull between us had begun in earnest. The evening had settled into a quiet rhythm, with rain tapping steadily against the window and a chill creeping along the edges of the apartment. I had been sitting on the couch, absorbed in a book, when she appeared in the doorway, adjusting the scarf around her shoulders. Her presence alone seemed to bring warmth, but I could see her shivering ever so slightly, the cardigan doing little against the cold that had seeped in from the city streets. "It's cold tonight," she murmured, her voice soft, almost a whisper meant for herself as much as for me. There was no pretense in her words, no hidden agenda, just honesty and a subtle vulnerability that made my chest tighten. For a moment, I hesitated, aware of the magnetic pull between us and the delicate balance we had been maintaining until now. Then, impulsively, I said, "Then share your blanket." The words were casual, but the effect was immediate. She blinked, surprised, and a faint flush colored her cheeks. Slowly, almost shyly, she moved to sit beside me on the couch, and I draped the soft, wool blanket across both of our laps. The warmth of the fabric pressed lightly against my arm, and I realized just how aware I was of her. Her shoulder brushed mine as she settled closer, and the simple contact sent a quiet shiver through me. Her hand, resting near mine on the blanket, was tentative at first, but neither of us moved it away. We shared the space without speaking, the silence itself charged with awareness. I noticed the subtle rise and fall of her chest as she adjusted herself against the cushion, and the faint scent of her perfume, mingled with the wool, lingered in my senses. Our fingers brushed once or twice as we adjusted the blanket, and each accidental contact felt electric, gentle, intimate, but entirely safe. I was conscious of the warmth radiating from her, the softness of her presence, and the quiet rhythm of her breathing next to mine. We didn't talk much, yet the closeness itself was a language. Every glance, every subtle movement carried unspoken words, conveying trust, attraction, and a growing sense of comfort. I realized how rare it was to feel this way with someone, not just drawn to their presence, but deeply aware of the effect they had on you with the smallest gestures. By the time she stood to leave, the tension lingered between us, unbroken but transformed. That shared blanket had been more than warmth against the cold, it had been the first physical acknowledgement of our emotional connection. The spark was no longer just in glances or fleeting touches, it was tangible, palpable, and quietly insistent. And as I sat there, feeling the faint impression of her shoulder against mine, I knew that the slow, deliberate pull between us was no longer subtle, it was beginning to shape everything we were yet to feel. The morning after our first shared blanket, the apartment felt simultaneously warmer and heavier. Warmth from the radiator and the memory of last night's closeness lingered, but there was a quiet tension in the air I couldn't ignore. I found myself overthinking every glance, every word we had exchanged, or hadn't. The simplest gestures now carried meaning I wasn't entirely prepared to confront. Breakfast was an unassuming affair, 2 steaming mugs of coffee, toast, and the faint aroma of her perfume mingling with the scent of brewed beans. The sunlight slanted through the blinds, casting soft, golden lines across the table, illuminating her face in a way that made her features seem softer, more vulnerable. I caught her gaze lingering on me once, twice, and quickly looked away, my chest tightening with a mix of desire and hesitation. I noticed the subtle movements I had barely registered before, the way she brushed a strand of hair behind her ear, the small tilt of her head when she smiled, the way her hand rested near mine on the table, but never quite touching. Every tiny detail seemed amplified now, weighted with unspoken possibilities. The ordinary act of sharing breakfast became a silent study in restraint, curiosity, and longing. I wrestled with my own thoughts, torn between desire and the knowledge of boundaries. She was my landlady, someone I respected and admired, and yet the pull between us felt undeniable. I wondered if she had felt the same thrill when our fingers brushed beneath the blanket or if I had imagined it entirely. The question gnawed at me, leaving a quiet ache of anticipation that neither of us dared to speak aloud. Her eyes met mine again, softer this time, almost as if she, too, was navigating the delicate terrain between propriety and yearning. I caught the faintest hesitation in her movements, an unspoken acknowledgement that she, too, felt the magnetic pull but was carefully weighing its significance. There was a vulnerability in that hesitation, a quiet honesty that made my own feelings feel simultaneously urgent and fragile. The tension between us wasn't just about attraction, it was about the quiet awareness of one another, about the thrill of connection tempered by hesitation. Our hands remained apart, our words measured, yet every glance, every shared smile, carried the weight of everything left unsaid. I felt it pressing against me, subtle but persistent, the slow crescendo of a desire that was emotional before it was physical. By the time breakfast ended, I realized that this internal struggle, this delicate push and pull, was part of the attraction itself. The tension wasn't a barrier, it was the first true test of how our connection might evolve. And as she left the room, offering a small, lingering smile, I knew that the quiet storm of desire and restraint had only just begun. The apartment was quiet that evening, the city outside muted under a soft drizzle that blurred streetlights into shimmering pools of gold. I had been reading in the living room when I noticed her at the window, pulling the curtain slightly closed against the chill. She shivered just slightly, and without thinking, I stood and crossed the room. "Here, take this," I said, draping my jacket over her shoulders. The fabric was warm, soft, and smelled faintly of laundry detergent, a mundane detail that somehow grounded the moment in a sense of intimacy. She looked up at me, her eyes wide, catching the dim light from the street, and for a heartbeat, time seemed to slow. Her head tilted subtly toward my shoulder, just enough to close a fraction of the distance between us, and I felt the warmth of her presence pressing gently against me. The simple act of standing close, sharing space without a word, was laden with meaning. Her fingers brushed the sleeve of my jacket, tentative yet lingering, as if testing the boundaries of comfort and desire. We didn't speak at first. The silence itself was heavy, charged with everything we hadn't said aloud. I noticed the way her shoulders relaxed ever so slightly as she leaned into the warmth, the faint catch in her breath when our sides touched. Her eyes, soft and searching, held an unspoken question, and I realized that we were both aware of the pull between us, quiet, steady, and insistent. "I didn't realize how cold it would get," she murmured, her voice low, almost a whisper. It wasn't an apology, and it wasn't a complaint, it was a confession of vulnerability that mirrored the feelings I had been trying to keep at bay. My heart thudded, not from the cold, but from the gravity of the moment, the slow, deliberate acknowledgement that desire, emotional and subtle, had taken root. I found myself reaching out, lightly adjusting the jacket at her shoulders, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. The contact was fleeting, yet electric. The soft warmth of her skin, the faint scent of her perfume, and the quiet rhythm of her breathing made every small gesture feel monumental. For the first time, there was no hesitation between us, just a mutual, silent recognition of what had been building slowly for days. We lingered like that, close but careful, the tension between us thick but tender. It wasn't neediness or impatience, it was the deep, deliberate pull of two people realizing they were ready to share more than casual proximity. That night, standing together in the quiet hum of the apartment, I understood that the slow burn had reached its first true peak, a confession of desire expressed not in words, but in warmth, presence, and unspoken understanding. The first snow of winter fell gently outside, dusting the city in soft white light. The apartment, once sharp and cold, now felt cocooned in warmth. The radiator hummed quietly, the coffee mug steamed on the table, and the gentle glow from the floor lamp filled the living room with a golden haze. Tonight, there was no rush, no hesitation, just the two of us sharing the quiet intimacy that had been building over weeks. She moved to the couch, pulling a thick, wool blanket from the back of the chair. "It's cold again," she said softly, almost as if testing whether I would remind her of the last time we shared this simple ritual. I smiled and settled beside her, the blanket draping over both of us. Her shoulder brushed mine naturally, and this time, neither of us flinched. The warmth from the fabric, the proximity of our bodies, and the gentle press of her arm against mine was comforting in a way that made the city's winter chill feel distant and irrelevant. We sipped tea, the faint scent of chamomile mingling with the lingering perfume she always carried. Words were sparse at first, as if neither of us wanted to disturb the delicate balance of the moment. And yet, in those pauses, there was conversation, quiet laughter, shared glances, and subtle gestures that spoke louder than dialogue ever could. Her fingers brushed mine as she reached for her mug, and I didn't pull away. The simple contact carried the weight of everything we had yet to say aloud. Eventually, she leaned slightly into my side, and I felt the steady rhythm of her heartbeat against me. It was a grounding presence, gentle yet insistent, reminding me of the trust and closeness we had nurtured slowly, deliberately. Her eyes met mine, warm and honest, and I realized how much we had come to mean to each other, not as landlord and tenant, but as two people connected by quiet desire, care, and respect. We talked about life, shared memories, and future dreams, the age gap between us no longer a silent tension but a facet of our bond, enriching our conversations and the depth of understanding we offered one another. Laughter came easily, mingling with the occasional comfortable silence, each pause punctuated by small, affectionate touches, a hand resting briefly on a knee, a gentle nudge, the brush of hair from her face. By the time she finally stood to leave, the blanket had wrapped us in warmth, our closeness lingering even as she moved away. We shared a final, fleeting touch of hands, a lingering glance, and a smile that spoke of mutual understanding and desire restrained yet acknowledged. The slow burn had reached its natural conclusion, a deep, tender intimacy, emotionally and physically satisfying, leaving both of us aware that this connection was no fleeting moment, it was enduring, cherished, and built on trust and shared vulnerability. That night, alone in the quiet apartment, I felt the calm contentment of something rare, a love that had grown slowly, intentionally, and with a warmth that would linger long after the winter passed. If this slow burn story warmed your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more age gap romance tales that linger long after the credits roll. Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever felt a connection that grew quietly, almost imperceptibly,